Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. I think it's time I clear the air about something that I've talked a lot about here on this show, and that is the idea or topic of change, how and why people change. I think when many of us hear the word change or think about having conversations to try and elicit some sort of change, we default to thinking about the other person and their actions, their behavior, their mindset, their attitudes, their beliefs, and that change is getting them to go from one state of action, belief, mindset, what have you, and move in a completely 180-degree direction towards the opposite of that change. And that's been covered here many times here on this show. I mean, I think about Jack Buckby and his conversation with me about moving from the far right, the extreme far right, to more of a middle-centered approach, and how he's gotten pushback that he didn't shift from his extreme far right views over to the left, all the way to the left, and how much pushback he's gotten through that change. We can think of people like Daryl Davis, who has been on this show, who has sat down across from Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizards. And he said in our conversation, his goal was never to change that person's mind or behavior. He simply wanted to understand. And in doing so, behavior change did happen over a long period of time, but that wasn't Daryl's goal, even though I think many people would look from the outside in and see, oh, Daryl changed those people. And Daryl even said to me, he was an impetus for change, but he was not the reason people changed. Those are heart changes that happen over a long period of time, where the commitment is to remain in the tough, uncomfortable conversation. The thing that I want to clear up about change is that I'm actually not often talking about this sweeping 180-degree change that I think a lot of us have in our heads when we think about changing someone. And by the way, rare is the time when changing someone should be your goal going into the conversation. However, the thing that I want to clear up here is that more often than not, change is a feeling. Change is a slight shift or a almost imperceptible movement, feeling, shift in the tone or energy that the conversation holds. Go back to episode 103 with Fred Dust, the author of the book Making Conversation. This is how he described it when we spoke. And so often I look for moments of collective feeling, not necessarily people sort of saying, oh, I agree 100% with that, but more like the sense that people are at least comprehending that what's in common with each other and what's not. So it's a feeling-based activity almost more than it's a knowledge-based activity. Keep along that same mindset or that same framework of change being more of a feeling. My guest in this episode, Aden Nepom, believes that change can be more of a feeling of joy. Aden is the owner of an organization started by her father called The Art of Change. And Art of Change was founded on a core principle that great interpersonal communication is how change happens. But as you'll hear in this conversation with Aden, again, this reaffirmment that change actually happens through feeling, through slight shifts, where you don't go into conversation with others with the goal of changing them, but through incredible interpersonal communication in a commitment to keeping a relationship rather than polarizing through our language. That's where change can happen. And I want to be clear here. What if the change that you seek has more to do with a change in understanding and feeling rather than a change in behavior or mindset or belief, at least in the immediate? What does that change look like? That's what we get into in this conversation with Aden Nepom. In your TEDx talk, you said, and I quote, I help people build better habits around the way they communicate and collaborate with each other so that they can experience more joy in the work that they do and get more satisfaction out of what they're doing. Aiden, how do you define joy?
Ooh, that's exciting. This is the first time I've ever been asked this question about how do I define joy. I think joy is a feeling at the end of the day. And the definition of joy is best described through sensation. So when you feel a sense of like goodness in your self, in your body, if you find that you smile when you think about the thing that you are engaged in, if you are excited to tell people about what you're doing, all of those things help create that wholeness that is joy, at least as far as I'm concerned. So it's less of a of a word definition. I'm not Webster's dictionary at the end of the day. And since it's a feeling, I can really only describe it in this like simile, metaphor, analogy territory.
Why did the pursuit of joy then in the work that we do become such a motivator for you, such a thing that you want to help people experience?
I think that's legacy stuff. So when Art of Change was founded by my dad, um, the singular goal was to make the world a better place. And my dad's background as a doctor, he felt that started with reducing stress, and the workplace is such a huge role to play in how much stress we experience. And then if you boil it down even further, that's where you get into how people interact and communicate with each other. I mean, you have to keep in mind that evolutionarily speaking, we have evolved into a place where rejection feels like death, right? Where if we think the tribe is excommunicating us, and by tribe, I mean colleagues at work.
Yeah.
I mean, if your friends no longer accept you because you have a weird idea, those things feel like death. So in order to reduce the amount of stress, my dad saw that helping people to communicate and build better interpersonal connections reduced a lot of stress in people's lives. And so let's do that at work. So I grew up with a guy who was dedicated to that and then inherited a company that does that. So I think it makes sense that as I got into things that promote joy, like improvisation or music or things like this, that I'm still coming from that place of being raised to bring joy and reduce stress in people's experience.
Aiden, you kind of touched on it there, but I'm curious how has your pursuit of as you've taken over Art of Change,
Mhm.
how has your pursuit of joy and stress reduction for others in the work that they do differed from your dad? And because he started the company, he built the company
Yeah,
and then handed it off to you, perhaps differed
yeah.
and is the same. How do you see those two overlapping?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about what things are the same. Both of us are entertainers, but we're different kinds of entertainers. He's a much more scripted guy. Both of us are storytellers, but we're different kinds of storytellers. He was more of a punchlines per minute kind of a storyteller. And I come from a place of improvisation and in the moment connection. So a lot of the storytelling that I bring when I speak or when I illustrate a point in a workshop comes from that place of authenticity and genuine human experience. So relatable in and engaging in different ways. And that's not to say I can't be funny. It's just that I have never really put my emphasis on am I getting the laugh? Um, for me, I want to get the head nod. And for my dad, at the time that he was getting into this work, he was also getting the head nod, but the way you got that head nod was through laughter. So it's just like different avenues towards that same objective.
Yeah.
But where things are really similar is in the tool set, the communication tools that are legacy art of change communication tools. My dad was, for people who don't know, my dad was Dr. Rick Kirschner and still is. He's going to listen to this and be like, "What do you mean was? I'm right here." Um, he's just retired, but he is the best-selling author, co-author of "Dealing with People You Can't Stand," and the author of "Click with People." So he has a whole bunch of tools that he and his partner Rick developed in this field. And so if it ain't broke, my only change that I've made is to activate these tools differently. So
Mm,
instead of activating these tools solely using humor and storytelling from a relatability standpoint, it's really important to me that people have practice in the room, because habit change doesn't come when you simply are told a new idea and then you're like, yes, I think I'll just do that now. For most people, they need to feel what it feels like to do something differently. So that's where that training and improvisation has really come back into this work. In order to get people that practice, I have people have experiences in the room. And that's not to say I'm putting people on stage to make them do improv comedy or improv theater. In my experience, that kind of like spontaneous ambush, you're a performer now, can really backfire in the development of new skills. Um, so I don't necessarily do that. But I do want people to interact and to experience change in the space before they walk out the door, so they know what they're doing differently.
I'm sure there are plenty of people who just breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Oh, thank God she's not putting people on stage to do improv."
I have to reassure people when I come into a room and say, I have a background in improv, and don't worry. You don't have to do that today. Um, but the truth is that life is unscripted. We're all improvising anyway. So,
Exactly.
you might as well polish those skills. Why not?
Exactly. Something you said right there, the distinction that you made between, people don't wanna just be told how to change and then will naturally go do it. They have to
Mhm,
experience it. Aiden,
mhm.
that's a lot of the work, then the message that I've tried to share on this show about change and how and why people change. I'm curious, how did you come to understand that to be true?
I, I think that's come from many directions. My earliest understandings of how people change came from the classroom. I taught improv theater. I taught English as a second language. So I worked with people on developing skills from pretty early into my career. And the number of times that we would go out after a class and people would ask me my thoughts about something having to do with the improv stage, and I would just tell them, and then nothing would change. Uh, it was very apparent that for them to really understand what I was talking about, they had to experience it. And so there was that piece of it. I'll also say that the improv school that I taught for, owned by Shana Merlin in Austin, Texas, she gave me such useful feedback as I was coming through as a teacher, that she really pointed these kinds of things out for me as well. She really pointed out that I can be a talker. I love talking. It's why I'm doing podcasts. It's just fun to talk. But talking to people is different than them experiencing what they need to experience. So that was one piece. I'll also say that I host the Changed podcast, although that podcast is on hiatus indefinitely. Um, there may be a definite time it comes back, but in in speaking with my guests about their experience with change, I feel like my understanding was really enriched and transformed there as well. One conversation that really sticks out for me was with Andrew Sullivan. He pointed out to me that a lot of people want to skip grieving when they go through a transition,
Mm,
and that blew my mind. I was like, "What are you even talking about? As long as you got your eye on the future, you're in great shape." And he was like, "Sure, but also you need to grieve the past. And what's in the past are the expectations of the future. So that picture that you paint for yourself of how you think it's supposed to be, that goes away when change actually shows up." So there's also that piece of transition, and that really transformed my understanding in a significant way. So there's a lot of that was a long answer to a really simple sounding question, but I think that life is complicated and so is change. And as I've grown, my understanding of change continues to evolve.
Oh, goodness, I could not agree with with that statement more. Same for many of the same reasons you just outlined, but that piece on grief is super interesting. How does that? What does
Isn't
that
it?
look like? What does that grief of past expectations look like?
Yeah. Well, it could be really something really small. Like imagine you're in, let's put it in the workplace as an example. So imagine
Right.
you're in an ideation session and everyone's throwing around ideas for a microsecond, even. When you throw your idea out there, you have pictured what that looks like. You've heard people giving you feedback on how great that went. You've seen, you've seen and felt the success of that idea prior to you opening your mouth. Even if you feel hesitant to share it, there's that little bit of like you saw the future. And then if that idea either gets shot down or the direction of your project pivots or whatever, a little piece of you inside needs to go, it's okay to let go of that idea. To
Mm.
It doesn't have to be, you don't have to like wail and sob and shake your fists at
Sob
the
and
universe for, right? But a little bit of like breathe into whatever that emotion is and allow it to show up. Disappointment is an okay thing to experience. I think where we get into trouble is when we place that on other people's shoulders. But
Mm.
it's okay to have that moment of like, oh, that was a little disappointing. Now I'm going to shake that off so I can be in the game. So if you're shaking it off, great. And for some people, these transitions can happen really quickly. But we often want to press people on really big changes to shake it off fast and to just move forward into the future, and to get into a more outside of the workplace example of that. um, i I had someone in my inner circle lose their spouse,
Mm.
and the amount of exterior pressure from people who loved and cared about this person to move on was intense.
Mm.
And that's like a tangible grief, a loss, the significant change from being coupled to being alone in this universe. Uh, that's something that you can't just skip past the grief part. So there's two totally different examples, of course, but I think you can see how there's middle ground, and that's very rich, that encompasses all these other little changes from the tiny that you can move past pretty quickly, a deep breath and let go, to things that really deserve the patience and the honor of being like, hey, there's some grief here. So one of the things that I've done with coaching clients who are moving like from one job to another job is I'll give them what I call a grief journaling exercise, where they catalog the things that they are letting go of by moving from the job that they were in to the job that they envision for themselves, um, the career path they'd like to be on, for example, because that's a place where, or breakups, you gotta
Yeah.
catalog. What did you learn from the experience? What did you imagine that experience was going to give you? What did you picture that didn't happen? What did you try that didn't work? What didn't you try? What weren't you willing to do? All of those things are part of that grief process. And then when you've got it all out of your system, you're like fresh and ready, and you've got lessons that you can take with you that you can carry into the next thing.
Is it fair to characterize it as an awareness? an exercise in self-awareness to acknowledge in the moment your feelings, your emotions, and then give them appropriate weight to the situation. Am I characterizing that
Yeah, I think that's a really
fairly?
nice summary of that. It would have been good if I could have said it that quick. But I think but I I do think I do think that that's a really great way to say it. I do. And the reason that's important, I think people wanna breeze past it and just go straight like, you lose a job, you're like, "All right, time to start job hunting." Um, I think the reason people wanna breeze past it is we want to be resilient, we want that buoyancy, but what I've come to understand after that conversation and then observing what happens in me and around me with my clients and the stories that I've heard is that if you don't take the time to acknowledge the inner planes, they just that's where self-sabotage shows up. That's where you just start getting in your way because you're still ruminating whether you want to admit it or not. So that's why it's useful to attend to those things so that you can put them aside now. Okay, that was my expectation. That was the beautiful dream. I can acknowledge that that's what I wanted, that that's what I'm not going to get. And now I can think about what do I want instead with the cards on the table being what they are.
Fascinating stuff, Aiden. I love that. I love that perspective. The We began this conversation talking about people finding joy and satisfaction in the work that they do. We've kind of started to go down this path, but I'd love to like put a point on it. What is keeping, in your experience, what is keeping people from experiencing that joy, that satisfaction as it relates to how they communicate at work? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with mindset. And I think all of us can relate to going into a conversation and eh, feeling concerned about how that conversation was going to go, and then walking away from that conversation going, see, that didn't go great. Or walking into a conversation feeling unconcerned about how it was going to go and walking away feeling surprised by how great it went. So there's a lot that has to do with our mindset when we walk into a conversation. What is it that we are assuming that's useful? What are we assuming that's really unhelpful? And then then there's the delivery, there's the listening skills, there's a lot that goes into interpersonal connection. But I think that where people tend to get in the way starts with how they walk in.
Where do those assumptions come from in your experience?
Oh, I think according to neuroscientists, it's like this is unconscious bias territory, right? So we're making assumptions all of the time, and our ability to make mental shortcuts is what allows us to function in the world because the amount of data that we're taking in at any given moment. If we were to pay equal amount of attention to each of these little bits and bytes of information, we'd be paralyzed in analysis. So shortcuts are great. They allow us to move forward. I don't have to analyze, am I putting on my left sock or my right sock today? I can just put my socks on, right? So that's why we do it. That being said, our default assumptions can really get in our way if we don't take time to make some mindful, useful assumptions going into communication. One of my favorite stories is there was this training, this was back when I was working with a company called On Your Feet. So this is a story that belongs to On Your Feet. They're in a sales training with I don't want to name the company, but it's a big company. And we do a bunch of mindset work. And somebody in the back is like, yeah, 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 have a positive attitude. I get it. But
Hmm.
my customers are idiots. So the question was, well, how's that working for you? Well, they're idiots. They don't buy anything. They don't ask the right questions. They're idiots. So you can imagine uh, how successful this guy was not very successful because we can feel that, right? If a
Yeah.
salesperson comes to talk to us and they treat us like we're an idiot, we feel that inherently. Um, there's all this stuff that happens in the inner planes. That's why that mindset work is so important because when you walk in thinking you're an idiot, then you treat people like they're an idiot. At Art of Change, my dad always taught me belief, behavior, experience. That's our framework. If you believe something's going to be a certain kind of way, you behave as if that's already true. That's that unconscious bias thing. And then we select the data that reinforces that belief. So our experience validates. And then it just reinforces, it becomes a perpetual cycle. So, you know, my dad used to deliver it like, you know, if you think somebody's a jerk, how do you treat them? The audience would always go, like a jerk. And he'd be like, yeah, you say things like, read my lips and talk really slow. I'm going to say this slow so you can understand. Right. And then, of course, that person's going to start like making faces at you because you're talking so weird. And then you're going to think, man, what a jerk. So that's how my dad used to deliver it. It's still very relatable. I'll give you a very pertinent example. This is what I use when I teach. Currently, in our very divided political landscape, if you go into a conversation assuming someone is ill informed, you're going to talk to them like they don't know anything,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And whether they're informed or not doesn't matter because they're going to look at you like, what are you talking about? Right. And then you're going to go, see, I knew they didn't know. It just reinforces it. If you walk into a conversation thinking somebody is filled with hate, how do you communicate with that person? You're probably on the defensive. You're probably angry.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff is going to lead that to escalate, which will give you the experience that person is really hate filled because look how angry they are. Look how upset they are. But your experience was created by your behavior walking in there with that mindset about that person. So that's what I mean. I'll stop there because it's like, obviously, I could keep going and give a million examples, but I'll stop there because I think the point is really clear. If you want somebody to interact with you, make useful assumptions like, uh, this person has the best of intent. That's a really popular and useful assumption. Assume best intent. Um, Even better than that, assume that person has something they can teach you that you don't know about.
Mm-hmm. Aden, you are, I don't know that you know this, but you are describing my ask then see methodology perfectly, my of
Oh,
conflict
really?
communication. It's the ask stands for assume positive intent, set aside your ego and know that you don't know everything. And in those examples you
Mhm.
gave, that's exactly what you're advocating for us to walk into these conversations and into these
100%.
situations, whether in work or outside of work. Let's go back to your point or example that you made earlier. You have this idea going into a meeting and it gets shifted slightly or perhaps outright rejected, and you talked about the grief
Mhm.
of that. But even just the assumption that the other people in the room who changed your idea or rejected your idea did so with a positive intent in mind, and you can set aside
Right.
your ego and know that you don't have the full story until you ask questions to get there.
Mhm.
You're I just love how wonderfully your perspective aligns with what I've heard on this show over and over again, and why I wrote that in my book. The assumption of positive intent. I'll ask
Yeah,
I'll ask
assuming positive intent is good.
I'll ask you why, but it's good. I think we both agree on that. Why is it so stinking hard to do in the workplace, especially? Well, let's leave politics and social issues out of this for now. Let's dive
If
into
you
the
insist.
workplace. Oh, please.
Yeah.
We're going to get enough of that over the next few months. Why so hard in the workplace? I mean, these are not people that
Yeah.
necessarily we choose all the time to work with. We can choose where we work, of course. And in some instances, maybe we've hired these people, but why assuming positive intent is what about it makes it so difficult in the workplace?
Well, let's take a look at it from the individual contributor standpoint, right? So a lot of folks I see online complaining about their micromanagers. This is a great example of where assuming intent can really bite you or serve you. So when we start assuming that someone is up in our business as an individual contributor, that they're doing that because they don't trust us or they're an idiot, or they don't know how to manage, or any number of things that are really unhelpful. What that does, and you'll have experienced this if this is you, is it escalates your own feelings that I'm in the wrong place. I can't stand working with that person. And what it doesn't do is alleviate that tension, where what you want is to have your micromanager not micromanage you. You want to feel trusted. You want to show that you're of value, and you want them to recognize your value, right? So by assuming that there is a positive intent behind that behavior, that will allow you to get curious about what might be going on. And sometimes you can fill in the blank with a made up but useful assumption about why something is happening, right? So you could assume that person is under a lot of pressure, and you could inquire about that. And if that's not the case, at least what you're not inquiring about is like, hey, why are you such a jerk to me? Why are you up in my business? Instead, you're like, hey, it seems like you must be under a lot of pressure. Is, what's going on with that? That's seeing their needs and issues. And if it's not that specific thing, they'll tell you. They'll be like, I'm not under pressure. Why do you think so? So
Yeah.
there's an opening there. So if you're going to assume something that's made up, assume something that's at least a door opener, and allows you to tap into that curiosity. And I think the same can go from a leadership standpoint, right? So let's imagine you are managing a team, and you have one person who everyone is reporting is like poisoning morale. Like you've heard from everybody, this guy's a real sourpuss. They poo on everybody's ideas, and they're ruining it. We hate being here because of this one dude. Um, as a leader, it would be really easy to believe that this person's intent in saying whatever it is they're saying is because they have a bad attitude, full stop. And they need to make it better. They need to fix their attitude. Well, there's a lot of things you might assume that could be a lot more useful than they're doing it because they suck, or because they're trying to poison morale, or they're out to get you, which would not be a useful assumption at all. You could assume and get curious about how much they care. You could assume that they care really deeply about something. Maybe it's the project, maybe it's the team, maybe it's the company, maybe it's their longevity in the company, but you could assume that they care about something, and that gives you something to get curious about, which is really where you want to be.
You have also mentioned in a lot of the work that you do that there's this gray area in our communication of where fear and joy meet. Am I describing
Mhm.
that accurately?
Yeah.
What does that look like? How does that play a role here? Our fear intermingled or in this weird gray area with our joy. How does that work or work at play here?
Yeah, I think that intersection of fear and joy, that place of limbo, I think that shows up in areas of personal development. I think it shows up in areas of communication, in areas of relationship building. So, you were specifically asking about how does that show up in communication?
Yes.
Um, and the way I think that shows up is like in all these other areas, we have an idea about what we should be doing, but we're really afraid to do it. And so we'll slip into a pattern of communication that's familiar to us, or a lot of times that default is just not having the conversation
Mhm.
in the workplace, because that's what feels more comfortable. We know it's not going to solve it. We know it's not useful. We know it's just bailing out. It's causing us stress to just hold on, but we do it anyway because it's familiar. And humans, for better or for worse, are hardwired to default to familiar over different. And that's, again, that goes back to this evolutionary biology that we all have in our brains, where it's like familiar means living, risk taking means we might fall off a cliff or get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So that's why we're afraid. But if you can remind yourself that you're not going to fall off a cliff or get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, you can take a look at that, and you can take the steps towards doing something different. Uh, and, start with assuming something useful. Um, Recently, literally over the weekend, my husband and I were receiving these furious texts from a friend of ours. This is not workplace related, but I do think it's sort of similar. I think it's related. Um, there's a colleague where she works who has a crush on her and messaged her, this is really awkward and you don't need to respond and all these things. He was like, I've just, you have pretty eyes and whatever. So says, like this big long message. And she's furious because he hasn't picked up on the social cues that she's not interested, because of all these default assumptions that she's making. It should be obvious when I move to the other side of the room that I am not interested. It should be obvious that when he talks and I don't laugh at his jokes, that I'm not interested. And the truth is, that's just a default behavior. The things that you think are really obvious, this is true for 99% of us. You think it's obvious, but if you haven't verbalized it, it's not as obvious as you think. And so we pointed this out and we were like, have you just said the words, um, I'm not interested? She was like, no, I shouldn't have to say that. And we were like, well, you do. And the same is true. I'm going to pull this back into the workplace. They're work colleagues, but that's, I think, an extenuating example. Like, I don't think that that's as common as, I hope it's not that common. Um, she wanted to report him to HR, and I'm like, why don't you just start by saying no and see where that goes? Uh, but I think where most of us experience that is we assume that it's obvious that we know how to do something really well. And then when we're not asked to do that thing, we see somebody else being asked to take that project on or whatever, we get offended. We're like, "Ah, that's my thing. But that's my thing. How did they not know that's my thing?" Well, have you told them? Like, how would they know that it's your thing? Ask yourself that. How would they know? Maybe they don't know. And just telling them, by the way, that's my thing, isn't necessarily going to do it either. People really like to see what your thing is. So think about what you're showing.
Love it. Okay, so we've talked about grieving when things do change. We've talked
Mhm.
about a lot about assumptions. You just kind of hit on, look, don't assume people know what you know, and say the thing that needs to be said. I think those are three wonderful communication examples of how to drive positive change in the workplace. What else is out there, Aden? What else to because we're all in the business of driving change in some way,
Yeah.
especially where we work, whether it's growing the business or whether it's signing that new account or whether it's completing that project. We're trying to go from one state to the next, bring about change. What other ways have you seen are ways that we can effectively communicate through that change?
Well, I just want to take a step back one moment
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
clarify that that example, those two examples are they're examples of that it's safe, feels safer to fall into that pattern of familiarity, but it doesn't get you where you need to go. So to
Yeah.
get out of limbo, you have to be brave. That I just wanted to reiterate that piece that it feels scary to say, this is my boundary. Or it feels scary to say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but I'd love to show you these things that I have done in that area, project area, so that the next time that you're looking for somebody for those skills, you consider me. Like that feels scary to say, but that's how you get out of that limbo between what you want and the unhelpful pattern. So I just wanted to clarify that. You dial up that bravery.
Wonderful clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. I realized I can be a little rambly occasionally, and so I just wanted to make sure I drove that home. But to your question of like when you're communicating change, like what is useful, what is helpful, I'm a big believer that uh, understanding is so as a leader, communicating change is really challenging. Um, it is hard to empathize with people who are like, this is how we've always done a thing, because you as a leader see the future picture so clearly. And all you want to do is paint that future picture and have people feel inspired. But as we were talking earlier about, there's grief when people go through change, and there's falling back on old patterns because they're afraid of the new thing. All of that is stuff you have to keep in mind as a leader when you're leading through change, that you're going to have people going through those experiences at their own pace around the stuff that you are trying to drive. So, communicating change is often, in my experience, a combination of empathy, patience, continuing to make the case for how this benefits them, and really having to communicate around all of those things, which is a lot, but it's not impossible. And the helpful assumption isn't necessarily these folks are really suffering, or these people need to grieve a lot. It's not necessarily a helpful assumption, but the helpful assumption I think here is, some people may go through this at a different pace, or some people may have concerns they really need addressed, or some people may really care, and I should be open to hearing what they have to say. Um, as a leader, it's useful to be open to hearing those things, because then that will help sort of pinpoint ways that you can communicate directly to those concerns and needs. If you shut them down, if you don't listen to them, it actually becomes harder to drive that change. Um,
Yeah.
but information is power. So opening up that curiosity is, I think, a really good idea when you're leading through change.
I'd love to get your thoughts on something that we do where I work full time, where I'm the director of marketing. We have started over the last several months using this phrase, or encouraging people to say what they need and want. I need this because it will do this. I
Hmm.
want this because it means this.
Hmm.
And as a leader, demonstrating that, saying, I need this done because it means this to the business, and I want this because it means this for you, for our team, for our organization, for our people, for me, and encouraging
Hmm.
that from our employees to say that in our meetings as well. What do you need and want in this
Yeah.
moment or on this project? I'm curious your thoughts. How does that land with you?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what that gets at is purpose. So whatever the structure is for giving purpose, it's great. I think that's a great structure. Really good. Um, a lot of times when people don't understand why something is happening, it they'll fill in the blank with something totally unhelpful. So I think being really clear about purpose is extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable when you're in conflict and you want to resolve that conflict, to have a really clear purpose for the conversation. And so I think it goes equally to this, like, if you're leading through change, or if you're making a request of somebody that's outside of their comfort zone, to really talk about the purpose of that. So that structure sounds awesome. I really like
Beautiful. Not that I was just looking for validation from you. I was just
it.
curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds great. Yeah, you hear people when they do mission and values work in their companies, they'll use purpose statements like,
Yeah.
the purpose of our work is to do X in a way that X, so that X, which is a formula I really love. Any formula you're using to get to purpose that helps you dial into that seems useful.
Aiden, I think we can probably guess or assume, to use that word, what the ramifications of are of not doing the things that we've discussed, of not leaning into the or of not wanting to stay safe, of not leaning into those old habits like you talked about when we communicate at work. What are the ramifications of this? How does this manifest itself in our roles, in our companies, in our jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so fun and interesting and silly to think about is actually to flip it in a way that, like, we actually all know how to make it worse on purpose. So if you just think about it that way, if you're like, "Oh, I know how to make things terrible." I you know, because that's the consequences. You don't make it good and make it bad. So that's it. It's like you'll be more stressed out and you'll have less joy at work. Like those are the consequences. So what I like to think about instead is like, okay, sometimes great communication can seem really daunting, or communicating change can seem really hard, or leading well, these things can seem really daunting, but the shortcut in my mind is to just take a moment and go, well, how could I make it worse? If I was really trying to make it worse, what would I do? And just make a little list. This is actually, I think this is a Tiagi game called Sabotage List. And you just like make a list. How do you make it worse? And then just do the opposite of that. Like you could do worse than to just like simplify your process of thinking here and just be like, okay, I'm going to not do those things. So I'm going to flip them around, do this. You know, I, it's great in conflict to think about like, well, you know how to make it worse. You know exactly how to make it worse. Those things are instinctual. Um, and we think it's really hard to make it better. But if you just flip those things, I'm just saying. Anyway, I'm repeating myself now because I think it's fun. But
I like that, a not to do list. Well, Aiden, how have you then personally experienced joy in the work that you do most recently? If that's your goal, I got to expect that you're chasing that for other people. You're chasing that yourself. How have you experienced that recently?
so I take so much joy from seeing how audiences respond. So if I'm doing any speaking at a large conference, I love seeing the audience come to life. Um, I had an event this past year that I'm getting ready to do again that I'm super looking forward to. I'll be with this group again in a month. And I'm looking forward to it because they were so skeptical when I showed up. This quirky woman with curly hair and like bright colors. The skepticism was so intense in the room. You could feel it. And the organizers had maybe 90% complete faith in me because this was our first time working together, but the meetings had all gone really well. So I was not concerned. But seeing the audience sitting back like this, that I'll be the judge of what you have to offer. And then having people come up to me and be like, this has been so valuable and so useful. That's the kind of stuff, praise makes me feel great. I love that. Um, the other piece that brings me joy. So I'm looking forward to going back and seeing these group again. But the
Real,
other
real
piece
quick
that,
on that. Real quick on
yeah,
that. I'd love to understand. What do you think was the lesson that you shared, or the thing that you shared that got them, that you saw that moment where they no longer were kind of leaning back with their arms folded and they kind of sat forward and started getting the head nod moments like you talked about
yeah,
earlier. What were you sharing, do you think, that kind of got them, that cracked the barrier?
I wasn't the one doing the sharing. I had them do the sharing with each other. My assumption is that the people in the room have something useful to offer each other.
Mm.
So rather than assuming that I'm there to be the bringer of wisdom and that they're all doing it wrong until I show up, that's not a useful assumption in what I do or what you do. So for me, what I do is I show up and I introduce myself as minimally as I possibly can. And I get people doing something with each other immediately. And then I hear what they have to say. And then maybe I share a story that illustrates a point, or I offer another point of view, or I show a tool and then I have them practice that. But they get to be the experts in the room. They get to be the resources in the room, and they get the practice and the feedback that helps that get better. So that's why the transformation, because what people tell me that they don't want or that they expected is that I think they see me as a colorful character. So they think I'm going to go up there and in like the, 1990s style of training, be like, here's a funny joke and here's a funny joke, and do something really cheesy. Like, everybody turn to your neighbor and give him a shoulder massage or whatever. And it's like, it's just not who I am. So I think that's what that's about. Um, so, so
Yeah.
that's why I think I get that feedback. People like to feel smart They like to feel like their value is noticed. They like to feel like they get the opportunity to help somebody else. There's a lot of things that people like to feel. And if you could give them those feelings, that's a good thing in any industry. So that's what
There's
I do.
there's a that's a
Yeah,
wonderful communication lesson in there. Absolutely. But please
absolutely.
continue.
Well, the other piece of joy that I get in the work that I do is because I have this improv background and I like making things together. I really enjoy and get so much joy from working with my clients, customizing the content that I have to their needs. It just is something that for me sparks joy, because it's the meshing of ideas. It's like there's just something about that hum of brainstorming going well, where it's like, here's an idea. Yeah, that's going to be great. Let's do some of this. Yes, that'll be perfect. And, what do they really need to walk out knowing? Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like that's what I like. I like pulling that kind of like thinking from my clients for them to really imagine what success looks like so that we can build something for that. If for me, it's like I get a little bit of a buzz off of that. So that's the other place where I pull tremendous joy from my work.
Beautiful. Love that. Hey, Aiden, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh, um, I think I don't have a wish for more questions that people would ask me more often. I don't think that's a wish I have. I think my wishes for people are bigger than that.
There's no tug at your heart saying, "Gosh, I have this thing I want to talk about, but or this thing that I know that could help people, but if they just ask me more about it."
I I just wish that in general, the thing that I'm most driven by these days is helping people have more relationship building communication than polarizing communication. And I, I know that people are really afraid to talk about politics in theory. People say they're afraid to talk about politics. And yet we're in an election cycle. And everywhere I go, people are talking about their politics
Mhm.
as if the people that they are talking to agree with them. And sometimes that's true. Um, and sometimes it's not true. And I think for me, and I've had people ask me about my politics recently, and like, I don't actually want anybody to ask me that. But what I wish is that people would just in general get more curious with each other about the future that they'd like to create, because I think that's a big gap. A lot of people want to talk about like, what do you think of this political figure, or can you vote for that person or whatever, but I'm more interested in what is the future that we want to create. And I feel that way when I work with my clients. I want them thinking about like, what's the end goal? Why are you concerned about teamwork on this team? What's the end goal? Are they meeting their bottom lines or are they not? What's the end goal? And I want people to think about that more often. So it's not so much a question I need people to ask me. It's like a wish for the universe, like, hey, humans, can we have some more forward thinking? Can we think about the second line of consequences for decisions we're making today, a little bit more often? That would be awesome. That's my wish.
Can you describe what you mean by those relational conversations, that relational communication instead
Mhm.
of the polarizing communication that you just referenced there? What do you mean by that?
Yeah,
What does that look like, Aiden?
absolutely. Um, so I don't think I'm alone in this based on conversations I've had with people. But during the last 6, 7 years, 8 years, there's been a lot of relationships lost because of disagreeing on politics, or disagreeing about one particular thing. Uh, and it's been, for me, it's really like, it's the opposite of joy producing. Every time I see somebody on social media say something like, if you don't agree with this, unfriend me now, or if or whatever it is, or like, or I thought you were better than that. That's another sentence that I see people in
Yeah.
reaction
Yeah.
to whatever point of view. And I've heard this come up in work environments as well, where it's like, well, we have to work together, but I wish we didn't, because, you know, that person voted for whoever. I don't want to name any specific political figures here today, because it's not about that. Um, but every time I see or hear about that, a little piece of me dies inside. And so
Same.
yeah, it's really heartbreaking. And I believe that the way forward is for us to have harder conversations than that. To me, the cutting out of people because they don't share your point of view on one item or three, um, is not a great path forward. That's how we get further polarization, and then we end up living in alternate universes in our single universe. So I very much believe that in order to have these conversations that are hard about stuff we definitely disagree about, it has to be about the relationship. How does it serve the relationship to have that conversation? And I believe it does serve the relationship when those conversations are held well. And I'll give you an example. That was a lot of preamble to get to an
Please
example.
do. Yeah,
Um,
no, that's great.
during so during the period of time when folks were coming out of lockdowns, and some businesses were open and some businesses were not, and there were policies in place about that, and some businesses didn't have policies about it. um, a good friend of mine and myself had a disagreement about a certain policy, and for me, I just was like, sorry, I think that policy um, is discriminatory. And so I'm going to not participate in spaces that have that policy. And what this person did was invite me to a conversation, which was just terrifying at the time. And we sat down and set boundaries on our conversation, which basically were like, if we start to get heated, let's have a safe word. It was like the simplest thing. Like, let's just set a boundary here, because here's the end goal for this conversation.
Yeah.
Both of us let out our end goals. This is also an expert communicator that sat down to have this conversation with me. But like, so we did all the things that we teach. We're like, what are our objectives for this conversation? Right. Here's how do we want to walk out feeling at the end of this conversation? Like, we laid it all out there, and it was like both of us agreed we wanted to feel heard. Both of us agreed we wanted to understand each other's different perspectives genuinely. And the most important thing was, because we were friends, we wanted to still be friends. So we set these boundaries. We came up with a safe word. We met at a neutral location, and the safe word was, let's just eat our breakfast, which we thought was funny. We're both in comedy. So and we never needed that safe word, not once, because we practiced all the things that we teach. So we started with that objective. We had already come in with the assumption that the other person we were communicating with was smart and was seeing something that we weren't seeing. So there's a gap that that person could fill in. And then we just shared perspectives and asked each other questions and genuinely wanted to know, and acknowledged we weren't going to walk out of that conversation having made a decision that was going to change anything for ourselves necessarily, but that was a possibility. I think that was maybe one of the most moving experiences that I had during that period of time, because neither of us had felt heard by anybody in such a long time. But we actually were able to like hug it out afterwards. The act of listening with genuine curiosity is such a generous thing to do,
Mm.
that even if at the end of that conversation you completely disagree with a person, the very act of having listened with genuine intent to understand, to acknowledge that it's a reasonable thing for somebody to draw a conclusion that's different from your own, that is a bonding experience. That will help to see each other as humans with reasonable ethics and morals that have simply come to different understandings. So that's an example of that. And I think that the more we do that, the better we will be. And if you need to take that into the workplace, do it. It's like just because we're designing a sneaker and I think it's red and you think it needs to be blue, doesn't mean we can't sit down and have a meaningful conversation. Tell me why blue is so meaningful, like, and after that, I'd love for you to hear why I think red is so great. And, maybe at the end of the day, we'll come up with like a purple shoe. I don't know, but like the objective is we need to walk out being not only coming to a conclusion from this meeting, but like let's also remember that we're going to keep working together, you know?
Well, purple is my favorite color, so I want I want the purple shoe that comes out of that
I know, I
collaboration.
love
But
purple.
Aden, that answer gave me so much joy.
Oh,
You just
good.
nailed exactly what I have advocated for the last 4 years here on this show. So that is a wonderful, wonderful place to leave it. And I cannot thank you enough for the perspective that you have shared today. Thank you so, so very much, and best wishes to you. Okay.
Oh, thanks, Michael. It was my absolute pleasure.
Towards the end of that conversation with Aden, I want to point out that as we record this episode, we're in the midst of an election season here in the United States. And for too long, we have seen relationships destroyed because of an inability to stay in tough, uncomfortable conversations, as Aden pointed out. And it's heartbreaking. As Aden explained, the way forward, the way that we can bring about the understanding, the change in understanding of each other and with each other, the way forward is to have hard conversations, which I get it at first blush may not feel joy producing, as Aden and I talked about in this conversation. But if you enter into those conversations with the goal or a striving to protect the relationship first, rather than your need for certainty or your need to be right or your need to protect your ego, perhaps. If you make your goal to protect the relationship that you have with that person, even though you may disagree, the change that you seek may not feel, at least immediately, even morally correct, even morally right to you when it doesn't happen immediately. You have deep seated beliefs. I get that. I understand that. But if you truly want to bring about the type of change that Aden and so many others on this show have talked about, that lasting, sustainable change where it may not be 100% the direction you want to go, but if you can admit that something is better than nothing, then staying in the conversation, even when it gets hard, can produce joy and can produce change. The dichotomy or the hard thing to get across is that behavior change, that mindset change, rarely does it work when that's your goal going into the relationship, because then you bring an attitude or an air of needing to be right, needing to be certain, and needing to force that person to change. I want to thank Aden for joining me here on this episode of Rethinking Communication. I appreciate you listening. If you have someone in your network who you think would benefit from listening to this conversation between Aden and me, please share this episode with them and help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and about the importance of communicating well and what that means. If you'd ever like to get in touch with me, you can always go to my website. It's michaelashford.com, or you can email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com. I'll catch you on the next episode of Rethinking Communication. And until then, keep asking questions.